You knew something was off the moment you woke up. You didn't know what it was exactly, but you knew in your gut that something was going to go wrong today. You should have listened. You went to school and met up with your friends, and you still had that feeling. You couldn't put your finger on it, but you knew something was off. Extremely off. Your friends met up with you at lunch, and they discussed with you how they wanted to have some fun tonight and try something new. They wanted to meet up in that rundown warehouse so that all of you wouldn't get caught. You knew deep down that it sounded like a bad idea, but you tried to be logical, and skepticism took over your mind. You didn't think anything would truly happen. You should have said no. The four of you went down to that warehouse and started to set up for a ritual to call spirits. Apparently your friends researched something called Nulvia, a magic practice that takes aspects from Wicca and Voodoo. They wanted to try out the rituals they could summon things they didn't understand just to see if they were real. And if by chance what they summoned was indeed real, then they would capture it on video and share it around the internet for popularity. You should have stopped them. You saw them create a heptagram on the floor with black spray paint, writing weird symbols from the diagrams they saw while they were researching Nulvia. You felt uneasy as you saw them set up candles, and even burn sage and set up salt to protect you all from anything evil that may try to attack you. However, even with all that protection, you still felt something was off. You should have stopped this. You all joined hands and chanted something one of your friends told you would make the ritual work. At first you felt nothing was wrong, even doubted that something would rise from the symbol in front of you all. You even started to joke around and snicker underneath your breath to calm yourself down. But there was still that hint of anxiety that told you to stop and run before anything happened to you. You didn't want to believe it though. You were convinced that nothing was going to happen. You even boldly called out the name of the spirit you wanted to summon and asked if it was there. You teased it because you thought nothing was going to happen. And when you opened your eyes with your friends, you looked around to see the candles and the sage were still lit. You sighed to yourself a little, and you started to boast about how much of a crock that ritual was. You should have done that. In the darkness, you can hear the panic whimpers of your friends. You felt the anxiety and fear in your chest pumping, trying to claw and escape from you. And you were frozen though, and you couldn't do anything but watch as the heptagram glowed a grayish light in front of you and your friends. You all saw the flames of the candles illuminate a reddish maroon flame light up one by one, and backed away from the ritual space. You all watched as the grayish light became a dim beacon in front of you, and a hand reaching out of it gripping the ground in front of you. It pulled itself up from the portal to reveal an ashen body with dark slits for eyes, a mangled and wide jaw with sharp teeth, long arms, big hands with 7 fingers, and an agile frame. You thought it looked human, but its features were disturbing. You could tell that it was something more intense and malevolent. It looked at you with its eyes and smiled, and you just stood there. That thing slowly walked towards one of your friends as he backed up. It just smiled as it backed him up into the wall and slowly raised him off his feet with its multi-digit hand. And as he screamed and pleaded for his life, it smiled as it ripped apart his face with its jagged teeth. Blood and viscera were tossed around as everyone looked on in horror, letting out blood-curdling screams as the monster chewed on your friend's face with absolute delight and swallowing chunks of its brain and skin tissue. You tried to make a break for it. That monster quickly threw down your friend's carcass and started to work on the other two, toying with him as he chased him around the warehouse. One of your friends, sadly, was caught by the neck and impaled by the creature's hand through his chest. You and your remaining friend stood by the warehouse door staring helplessly until the predator locked the ties on both of you. As you both stumbled out the door, the monster caught up on the heels of your last remaining friend. The last image you saw of her was a look of shock and immediate fear as she was dragged back into the dark warehouse. You can still hear her screams as you ran to your bike and pedaled away to safety. You should have avoided this. You shouldn't have done this. You shouldn't have came. As you rode your bike to freedom, you kept checking over your shoulder to see if that thing was following behind you. You looked at every shadow, every alley, every tree to make sure that the monster wasn't following you. And when you turned that last corner and made it into your neighborhood, you felt a relief feeling. You were for sure you made it there in one piece. That thing was too busy eating your friends to catch up to you, and there was no way you saw it in the shadows. Your mind was playing tricks on you. Or that's what you kept saying to make yourself feel at ease. You put your bike on the side of your house and then went to the front door to look inside for your parents. All you saw was darkness. But you remembered they were out tonight, so you had the house to yourself. You were safe, right? As you got out of the shower, you saw the news alert on your phone. The police found your friends and their mangled remains. They don't know what did it, but the story's still developing. You went down to the kitchen to get some water because you didn't have an appetite. As you closed the refrigerator door, you felt that same feeling you had this morning. That nervous and uneasy feeling hit your chest harder than anything you've ever felt, and you were scared to turn around. You then see a gray hand touch your shoulder. You were followed. The monster lifted you up and slammed you against the wall. You could feel your back throbbing in agony. You had fear in your eyes, and in that moment you regretted everything. You regretted not stopping the ritual. You regretted uttering those words that called out the demon. You regretted following your friends. You regretted it all. And you're probably asking how I know everything from your perspective, aren't you? That's simple. I watched you. I looked at you from my realm, and when you summoned me, your fear smelled so delectable that I had to taste it for myself. Looking into your eyes, I could see that delicious fear building up inside of you, and I know you don't want my appearance to be the last thing you see, but you're the one to blame for that. After all, you should have ran. My grandpa loved a good legend. He was nuts for him. Every time he saw us, he would spin a yarn that could enthrall an alley's worth of cats. He read about them in old books and random regional magazines he found from the weirdest of sellers. He always had a friend that was an insider that knew the real truth and was willing to tell my grandpa as long as he kept it to himself. Of course, he never did. He was as much of a gossip as he was a lover of lore. I loved his stories. They were always the highlights of my visits. He used to call me into his office and tell me his latest tale. His office, man. I can still see it in my mind. The walls were built-in bookshelves overflowing with books and magazines and curios that he would collect from secondhand stores. It smelled like the yellowing pages in those old tomes. Sometimes when I'm in a secondhand store, I get nostalgia from that scent. I was 16 when he got sick. It started out with a few trips to the doctors, but it quickly escalated to him being in the hospital full-time. The doctors didn't know exactly what was afflicting him, but whatever it was sure doing a number on him. For about a month, he lapsed into a coma, and we were sure he was just going to fade away. But then he didn't. For a few weeks, he would wake up at random intervals, mumbling something in a hoarse voice and slipping back into sleep. His throat was so dry that the words barely registered. Doctors were confused and still prepared us for the inevitable. They said that frequently people in this condition aren't really aware of what they're saying. Their brain synapses are just firing off at random, in their words. His whole system is starting to shut down. I don't know if you've ever had to watch someone slowly pass away, but it's the worst thing a person can experience. You want to stay hopeful for a miracle, but you know, deep down, you're just running out the clock. In your darker moments, you'll wish they would just die and relieve you of this torture, but then the guilt creeps in that you even had that thought, and you'll feel worse than you did before. It's a no-win situation for everyone. In short, it blows. I had started coming by the hospital just to sit in Grandpa's room after school for a few hours. It was quiet, and I could get some homework done and be close to him in these final moments. When I finished my work, I would tell him about some of the legends that I heard, mostly made up in hopes that he could hear it. It was therapeutic for me, and I look back at those times fondly. The last time I saw him alive is burned into my brain. He was sleeping, which wasn't uncommon, and I was working on poli-sci homework. And suddenly, I heard him call out my name. I snapped my head over and saw his eyes flutter open. Yeah, Grandpa? I said, putting down my pen. That's when I saw the look of fear on his face. Are you okay? No, he said, struggling to find his voice. No, I've been trying to hold out as long as I could, but I have to tell you. Tell me what? I asked, standing now next to his bed. They're coming, he said. They already got me, but
They're slowly coming for us all. I assume this was what his doctors were talking about. Who's coming for us? He stayed quiet for a minute, and then suddenly shut his eyes. And just then, a nurse walked into the room and nodded at me. Was he just talking? No, I lied. I had on the TV. It was loud. But the TV is off. Well, yeah, now it is, I said with a laugh. I just shut it off. I'm sorry. You're fine, they said. You didn't do anything wrong. The nurse eyed my grandpa. You sure he wasn't mumbling or anything? I'm pretty sure. He's been resting most of the time I've been here. Actually, most of the time I visit, all he does is rest. I'm sorry, the nurse said, nodding. I know it's not easy to watch someone go. Thanks, I said, looking at my grandpa's face. He looked peaceful. If he comes to, hit the call button and let us know, okay? Absolutely. The nurse left, and I glanced back at my grandpa. I don't know why, but I said, she's gone, as if he'd respond. My skeleton nearly leapt from my body when he replied, good. I thought he was back asleep, but he had just been pretending to sleep. Grandpa, I said, what's going on? The lost ones. They found a way to come back, and they're coming. The lost ones? We aren't the only beings who use our bodies. I gave him a confused look, and my eyes drifted to the call button. He noticed. Don't do it. Some of the nurses have been turned. I decided to play along. This might be the last whopper my grandpa gets to tell me. How can you tell if they've been turned? He strained to hold up his arm and pointed at his hand. There's a small triangle imprint on their palm. It's how they can tell. And who told you this? He took a deep breath, and you could see how he struggled with it. The end was coming soon, and I knew it. I did my best to keep it together. When I was under, he stated, I met a man who told me the truth. He said his name was Montgomery. He worked for the unit, and he said, my grandpa grabbed his heart, and I went to go push the button, and he yelled out, no! You need... just listen. Montgomery said... He said, look for the mark on their palms. And with that, his eyes rolled to the back of his head. I smashed down on the call button. A phalanx of nurses and doctors stormed in. They went to work, and I was pushed out into the hallway. Grandpa died a few days later. His funeral wasn't a somber affair. It was more like a party. Grandpa had touched so many people and enthralled them with his stories. He was a loving man that cared deeply about everyone, and often went without, so others go with some. Friends from his army days showed up, former co-workers, relatives, even a few hospital staff members. Even though he had been there for a short time, he made strong connections. As the wake was dying down, I had noticed a man I hadn't seen at the funeral in my house. He was tall, but walked stooped over like he's used to being in a space too short for his proper height. He had graying hair and a pencil-thin mustache. His pale eyes lit up when they saw me, but the rest of his face remained motionless. He made his way over to me and asked my name. I told him, and he nodded. Who are you? I asked. Did you work for my grandpa? In a sense, he said. My name is Montgomery. I'm sure he mentioned me. My heart sank. I wanted to vocalize a response, but I couldn't. I just nodded. The mark is near where the wrist connects to the hand. At first blush, it seems like a normal wrinkle to the skin, but look closer. It reveals itself. Those are the lost ones. What? Remember, there are no straight lines in nature. If you see a triangle, get away from that person as soon as you can. Why are you telling me this? Who do you work for? Who I work for isn't important now. I'm telling you this because you need to be aware of what might be coming for us. I don't understand. You won't until you will. When the moment comes, the tumblers click into place. Just be ready. To do what? Save us all. And with that, he turned and left. I never saw Montgomery again. It's been 10 years since my grandpa died, and so far, I haven't been called upon to save us all. I can barely keep a houseplant alive, so if I'm our last hope, we're all screwed. What's weird though, is that whenever I meet someone new and we shake hands, I always try to get a glimpse of their palm. I haven't seen a triangle yet, but I look for them out of habit. I dread the day that I finally see one because I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. And if this story was real, which of his others were too? He sat at his computer, tongue licking his upper and lower lips in anticipation. A long-nailed, fat, and grimy index finger clicked on the mouse at a dizzying pace. An observer might have thought there was an insane miniature tap dancer somewhere underneath the piles of filth that surrounded the man. However, no tap dancer could effectively practice their talents in this cramped and deplorable dwelling. The apartment smelled old. Old food, old clothes, old sweat, and old urine. Older keepsakes from a time when Meek was a different man than the behemoth sitting behind the computer now peeked through the places where the trash didn't take over. A narrow path wound its way around the dwelling, taking Meek to vital places he needed to go when life interrupted. A path to the bathroom that was rarely used anymore, and another that forked 30 degrees to the apartment entrance. Others led to the kitchen and what might have once resembled a dining room. Another path ended abruptly in front of the bedroom's entrance, a ramp of filth almost reaching the smoke alarm above the doorframe. The high amount of detritus that formed those paths were monuments showing the sloth of the recent past, an involuntary story from the ground up. Most of the bottoms were newspapers he used, back when carrying seemed to still be second nature, to soak up the vomit and spilled beer. After the insulating layers of refuse began to accumulate above them, however, the carpet became passé to his thoughts. An empty and flattened tampon box, whose corners jutted out from under the disgusting hillocks near his computer, caught the corner of his eye. His wife, Marie, had left him about a year or more ago, but he barely remembered what she looked like. Even the dust and grime-covered picture lying face up near the monitor offered a view of a woman he didn't really remember knowing. She took their infant daughter, Chrissy, with her, as it became clear that Meek was quite incapable of anything besides playing his online games. He suddenly kicked a small mound of pizza boxes under his desk in frustration, as his main game character fell to his demise off of a ravine and into a pixelated lava below. The group he was running this dungeon with would undoubtedly boot him out of the group for his failure to keep up. He kicked the mound again, his long, yellow, big toenail piercing a hole through a box and into what he perceived to be the wall beyond. The pain barely registered at first due to Meek seeing that his internet connection had been terminated. He stomped his other foot into the moist and brown colored spot on the floor to his left. A pungent smell that he had all but become immune to ran through his nostrils. He glanced at his fractured toenail, now resembling a misshapen tip of a bloodied spear. He grabbed the foot in pain and cursed the monitor before him. His game character, a skeleton at the bottom of a molten orange doom. He worked hard to get his game character to this point, and now this? Did he cut the coaxial cable that supplied his internet access with his toenail? Did he kick something else? Bald-headed Christ fuck, he shouted to the screen before him, a middle finger echoing what the mountains of garbage near him wouldn't let his voice do. He quickly stood, the crusty and stained seat cushion briefly sticking to his rear and bringing the chair up, and then down with the plastic wheeled bang. Trying to think quickly for a solution to his connectivity problems, he made his way along the kitchen path, slowly limping to the telephone. He was surprised at how much he had been sweating. Was the AC broken too? He silently thanked his dead mother for the trust fund that she had left to him that sustained his living for the past few years. He would call the landlady after the cable company. He became lightheaded as his overweight frame limped among the refuse and vomited into an empty cereal box before entering the kitchen. Grabbing a dusty and half-full beer off of what must be the dining room table, he drank, expelling the acidic taste from his mouth. He dry heaved from the taste of the old beer, thankful that the taste of the puke no longer lingered. He hadn't used the phone in ages. No need to, really. He used both hands to claw through some hamburger wrappers and matted paper towels to where he finally estimated his phone would be. Several cockroaches scampered away at his touch, their surreptitious duties temporarily on hiatus. He was correct in his assumption of where the phone should be. He was incorrect by thinking the phone was still there, however. He faintly remembered Marie saying how the phone's ringer would wake up the baby at night. Since they could only afford a one-bedroom place at the time, the kid had to sleep in the living room, and since they both had cell phones at the time, the home phone was redundant. So, did she move it? Put it away? Throw it out? Fuck me, he said as he picked a small, itchy brown piece of crust from the back of his leg, clawing at the skin underneath. His toe was bleeding worse now. The toenail much worse than he thought as he examined it in the brighter light of the kitchen. The nail cracked vertically, all the way down, apparently breaking beneath the skin as well. His toe was easily twice the size it had been before his Gimby trekked to the kitchen, a sickly wedding of purple and yellow. Meek didn't know the first place to look if Marie put it away somewhere, and quite frankly, he didn't feel like digging through any more mounds to look. Another option was the bedroom. There was a landline connection there. Maybe it was buried somewhere in there. His desire to get back to his game, coupled with his throbbing foot, prodded him to get back and look. He wobbled along the bedroom path, straight down the hallway, the carpet he trod on making sickening wet sounds. He paused for a glance into the bathroom he stopped using months ago. A brown canonical shape of a solid brown and green substance protruding from the grimy toilet. He could see several flies tending to their young among the shape, buzzing with parental defense as they sensed Meek's presence. Matted balls of toilet paper stood knee-high, occasionally broken by the mouths of empty beer bottles. The bottle tops almost looked like brown mouths drowning in a sea of disgust. Smears and handprints of a darker color lined the tiled walls. A picture hung by the entrance of the bathroom. Meek and Marie, standing in front of the lake at Epcot Center. The baby was nestled in Meek's arms, the peaceful shroud of sleep evident on her face as a happy father kissed her forehead. Was that taken before or after the wedding? He thought. He remembered that day. The baby cooing as the boat made its way through the tunnels in the Mexican section of the park. He had no idea why, but he also remembered Marie giving him a light but tender kiss on the neck as the boat sloshed its way through the artificial passages. He made his way towards the bedroom entrance, having to limp way through trash that he didn't remember making. Glancing behind him, he noticed that he left a red trail as his foot dragged behind him. Clearing the way to the door took longer than he thought. There were several large boxes hiding beneath the garbage that were heavier than he expected. Their contents unimportant as long as getting back to the game took precedence over all else. They were stacked high as well, almost reaching where the door met the frame. Throwing the last box behind him down the hallway with a grunt, he grabbed the doorknob and tried to open the bedroom door. It was locked. After several minutes of determination, a few pulls from his obese frame, and many curses of frustration, the door gave way, splintering the frame and showering Meek's forearm with wooden debris. The room was dark, cool, and surprisingly clean. The light shone from the hallway behind him, exposing the motes of dust that chaotically danced at the door being thrust open. Had he really not come in here at all over that year or two? The carpet was the perfect beige it was when his family moved in a few years ago. The pictures that Marie picked out still hung around the room, Parisian beatnik monstrosities that Meek still gave a disdain glance to. She insisted that since there was no windows in the room, she would make it as sunny as possible. The bed was made as well, the dark brown comforter looking eerily the same color as the putrescent contents of the bathroom he glanced at minutes before. The phone was on the nightstand on the side that Meek used to sleep on during cheerier times. With the sigh of relief that any heroin user can relate to after finally getting a reclusive fix, he limped over to the phone. One foot left a bloody streak, and the other left brown footprints on the unmarked carpet. Sitting down on the bed, he picked up the phone's receiver and started to dial when he noticed the square-shaped thing in the corner. Since he didn't turn the light on when he came in, and all the hallway's lights didn't reach the corner, he couldn't quite make out what it was. He gave his toe a rub, hand coming back bloody, and winced in pain as the dread of realization crept up on him. There was no dial tone. This could mean only one thing. Marie had canceled the service at some point without telling him, or more likely, he didn't pay the bill after she left. He couldn't remember. Grabbing the phone in frustration, he threw it in the direction of the square-shaped thing, cursing. He was getting very lightheaded now, the coolness of the room doing little to alleviate the sweat drenching his balding, fleshy head. He stood and hobbled over to the square thing in the corner. As he came up beside it, he grabbed the edge of it and winced in pain, his foot feeling as if it was on fire. He looked into the square thing, now finally realizing what it was, not just because of its physical shape as much as its contents. The long, decayed corpse of an infant lay in the center of the playpen. The skin almost resembled one of those purplish, super hot peppers that he used to see at the grocery store, making bizarre spiral patterns at the top of the skull. The infant had a permanent scream on its wrinkled and deformed face, as though it was seeing something horrible before its death. That horrible thing must have been loneliness, Meek thought as he glanced at his daughter. That thought was quickly dashed over as he noticed another figure sitting upright in the darker corner beyond the crib. Marie's eyeless face pointed to the ceiling in a look of pain, as if she died crying. One hand still rested on the corner of the playpen, and the other pulling down on her t-shirt where the breast had been. She must have given the infant, Christina, that's her name, one last meal before she herself had expired. Cursing in anticipation, he picked up the phone. It was thankfully still in one piece with a cord from the wall still attached to it, and hobbled to the bedroom door, deciding he would try the kitchen's phone receptacle, now out of a feverish desperation. As he made his way through the door frame, he immediately saw a problem. The heavy boxes that he had thrown behind him in a frenzy moments before now made a heavy wall that merged with the garbage piles. He could see a portion of his computer monitor, beyond, a bubbly orange haze through cardboard and refuse. His foot throbbed, and his chest suddenly contorted in pain as self-preservation began to take hold of his fevered body. Dropping the phone, he fell to his hands and knees and crawled towards the barricade. The first box before him wasn't so bad to move, but that next one was impossible, positioned as he was, and he slumped over it. He sensed a cockroach that he must have only partially killed with his weight tickle the side of his torso. Just a rest, he mumbled. The kitchen is just around the corner. So close. I will have my internet back within an hour. Just one phone call, he thought. Longingly looking at his computer screen through the cardboard and refuse cracks, his heart finally took his frustration, his toe pain, and him along with it.
Steve was dead for 2 days before we started talking about moving his body. Some of us didn't want to. We were worried about the neighbors seeing us. We were worried about the cops. We were worried about his growth. But in the end, we all decided we had to do something. It was January, gray and snowy outside, with a weak light that barely managed to penetrate into the house. Even at noon, it was still dark. The streetlights were on, and shadows flickered in their artificial glow. It was like the sun had died and we were living in the end times, the last residents of a dying earth. We all came to the house in different ways. Some saw it in dreams. Some read the address in fractured numbers of spam calls. Some heard the street names whispered at night, although when we woke up, there was no one in the room. I wrote the address down one night before I fell asleep. The next morning, puzzled by the address of a street I've never heard of and a city and state that I've never been in, I showed the note to my brother. Looking at it, he frowned and asked me who had written it. Me, I told him.
He stared at it for a minute and shook his head. That's not your handwriting. Even then, the house was tracing its outlines inside of me. A week later, I shaved my head and left my hair spiraled down the sink. Then I stole money from my brother. Not a lot, just enough for a bus ticket. I left a note that didn't say where I was going, just that I had to go somewhere. When I got there, I knew I was in the right place. The ruined houses and dead-end streets seemed to hum to me. Trees grew out of the roofs of abandoned row houses. The streetlights buzzed on and off. The house loomed, alone against the darkening sky. The windows were broken, victim of neighborhood children throwing rocks. There were no lights on in it. There were no signs of life. But we knew. The door was unlocked and I walked in, pausing as a smell hit me. Something rotten, old, diseased, but under that, I was breathing hard, sweating, my heart pounding against my chest. I felt like you do when you open the door to a bedroom of someone you're about to kiss for the first time. I licked my lips and stepped in. Most of us were already there. A few would still be coming. There were no lights, but the glow from the room with the closed door lit the empty room. Everyone sat on the bare wooden floor, legs crossed under them. The air throbbed, like a pulse inside of me that somehow became external. "Welcome home," they all said together, and I said it too. Welcome home. What was behind the closed door glowed even harder. We would go in, each of us once a day. The first time I went in, I could barely breathe. The girl who sat behind me came back from it, walking slowly, stains still around her lips, and whispered to me it was my turn. I walked and opened the door. No one noticed us for weeks. The broken streets were desolate. There was no reason to be there. There had been fires years ago, and all the people had moved out. The city talked of bulldozing the homes, but never did. Nothing empty stays empty. And all the dark and wet, things grew. A new life began. In the night, we ran fevers. I saw some of us sweat, watched drool run from open mouths, and saw the webbing in between fingers grow thicker and denser. We were turning. We never left, never turned on lights. We can see in the dark, but we weren't even seeing the old world anymore. We had a new vision, new colors to see. We thought we can stay forever, as every day a new one would join us, lulled by dreams, by taste, by strange visions compelling them from television sets. We would grow in the dark. We would devour and slowly spread. A new person arrived and someone saw. We didn't know, but someone had watched them walk down the empty streets into the empty house. They told someone else who told someone else who told someone else. The big house with the broken windows, they whispered to each other. The one where that guy killed his family 20 years ago. People are living there. They started to watch. We could tell. We didn't need to see. The glow from them at the edges told us. The ones who were changing the most moved to the middle of the room, so their slow lumbering bodies would be hidden if someone looked in. What was behind the door said not to worry. We felt tendrils squirm inside of us. One of us, one night, cut their stomach, and no blood came out. They pushed aside their skin. Inside of them, the beautiful growth bloomed, white and fruited and bright with a sticky dripping wetness. We reached out and touched them. They moved under our hands. Steve was the first to die. He was one of the ones that had changed the most. The growths were starting to push against his skin from the inside. His eyes had gone foggy and white with webbing, so he kept them closed. When he opened his mouth, you can see the stems and bulbs in his throat, on his tongue. It was hard for him to breathe, and we watched him. His chest rose and fell. His neck was thick with blossoms inside of it. And then he stopped breathing. We tried to feed him to the room, but it didn't want him. He was part of it. The growth did not eat the growth. We all understood.
We all were starting to understand a new kingdom was dawning. A new world was beginning. We looked outside and saw there were people standing with flashlights watching us. We let the night pass and let the cold morning come. The morning passed and the afternoon, and at some point the watchers left and I, who was the least changed, carried Steve away. I knew to take him to a new house, to bury him in a new room, and to let him eat the wood and rot. The watchers appeared when I was close to a new nest. They ran at me, screaming. I knew they would kill me, but I knew they were scared of me, scared of all of us. I dropped Steve on the ground. When they saw him, what his face looked like, his hands, they screamed. But it wasn't a scream of anger, of threats, of violence. It was only terror, complete and absolute terror. I ran from them into the warrens of abandoned buildings and streets, and they lost me in the desolate emptiness. I don't think they wanted to find me. I think they wanted to forget I ever existed. I found an old apartment building and made my way to the 10th floor. There, peering down, I watched them set Steve on fire. I saw the lights illuminate their faces. The fire burned orange and red on the white snow-streaked streets. The crowd moved to the house. They threw bottles with lit rags into open windows, and the fire began erupting. Snow was falling, on and off, hesitant and dirty white. The fire took hold and began to turn the house into more fire. The watchers stood and watched. I thought of the room. I thought of the first time I walked in. The smell in there was so thick. The fungus was everywhere. Flowered and white and blooming, it covered the walls and the ceiling. The floors were soft and weak under my feet. There were so many colors in it. Bright green and deep reds. Magnetic oranges and strange shimmering iridescent greens. Those colors all hinted at something beyond vision. A new spectrum. The smell was overwhelming. We always went into the room alone, but if there had been someone with me, I would have grabbed their arm. The scent of it, a deep rotten odor, made me weak. I dropped to my knees. The mushrooms were like a field of hallucinatory technicolor flowers. They moved to a breeze that wasn't there. I touched one. It was rubbery and felt warm in my hands. I picked it off the ground and bit. It squirmed in my mouth and I gasped. There was an electricity in my head. I swallowed it and dipped my head, biting the beauty's growth. I heard it talk to me. I heard it say, "This is a new world. This is a new world." Watching the house burn from the 10th floor, some of us staggered out into the streets, strains and beautiful growths erupting from their foreheads, on fire and dying, but most stayed in. The fire roared and I saw when it hit the room, a noise like an explosion, and then a bright cloud of white rose from the house and spread into the dark, cold air. It looked like snowflakes. The spores were everywhere, lifted by the cold winds off the dark lake to high above the city, spreading into lungs, into houses, into all the wet and secret places. Growing, and growing, sprouting tendrils and twisting new life into every spot it could. The watchers walked away. The fire died. On the wind, above us, and inside us, the spores lived. A new life was beginning. If you grew up in the suburbs, you were probably a decent distance away from nature. I'm not talking about a park or a pond or anything like that, but real deep woods nature. Get away from everything kind of nature. I know I was. Where I grew up, the closest natural camping area was at least 4 hours away. My family had a history of camping. We usually went to the river a few times a year and a few local campsites a few more than that. But we never really got off the grid. Our campsites always had showers and dumpsters and piped in water. Fish and game would always patrol at night. Campers and RVers as far as the eye could see. It was fun. I love being outdoors. I would beg my parents to let me camp in the backyard, but they always held a firm line. You're not old enough to take care of yourself yet. When I was about 16, I had turned a corner in my parents' mind. I was cleaning up after myself, doing my homework right away, helping around the house. I was maturing right in front of them. I was taking care of myself. This time, when I asked if I could camp outside, they sighed and they agreed. For my birthday that year, my parents had got me a small 2-person pop-up tent. They said I was ready to sleep alone on our camping trips, but I think they just wanted some privacy and I didn't want to ask why. That was between them and God, and I was happy to stay out of the equation. I planned on staying outside for a 3-day weekend. We had Friday off from school because of a local holiday, and I spent the day setting up my site. I cleared the land, I set up my tent, went grocery shopping for camping food, and my parents even let me dig a little fire pit. When the sun began to set, I said goodbye to my parents. I hiked the 50 feet to my campsite and started a little fire. I ate about a half a dozen s'mores. I kept the fire going until around midnight. I spent that time reading comics by the lantern light and staying warm. What I noticed was how different familiar places looked in the dark. My house was only a stone throws away from me, but it looked completely foreign in the pitch black. When my parents finally shut down for the evening, around 11 or so, it looked even more strange. Even in the suburbs, nature has a way of creeping in, especially at night. Just outside your warm little room, the night awakens all kinds of creatures. Crickets sing, owls fly and hoot, raccoons and possums crawl along the ground, dogs around the neighborhood bark and howl in the distance. A lot happens without you even being aware. When I started yawning, I decided I probably had enough. I doused my fire with sand and closed up shop for the night. I crawled inside my tent, zipped it up, and laid in my sleeping bag. As crickets chirped outside, I slowly drifted off to sleep. And then I heard it. Cliche as it might sound, I heard a stick snap in my yard. I wasn't worried right away. It could be any number of things. But I did open my eyes and listen a lot closer to what was going on outside of my tent. I heard the wind blow and the trees in my backyard rustle, but nothing sounded like a person walking around. I debated getting up, going outside, but my rational brain kept me in check. If it was a person and they wanted to do me harm, what could I possibly do? I laid my head back down and closed my eyes, but I knew there was no way I was going to fall asleep anytime soon. I kept my ears open and listened for anything out of the ordinary. Any other twig snapping or someone walking through a pile of leaves or something. After 15 minutes or so, I'm satisfied I haven't heard anything out of the ordinary. I finally drifted off to sleep. When you sleep outside, you wake up when the sun comes up. For me, that was around 6:30 in the morning, and I was not exactly pleased. I had a rough night's sleep and not nearly enough of one. I needed to go to the bathroom, so I put my flip-flops on and unzipped my tent and walked out. And that's when the blood drained from my face. Just outside the door of my tent were a few footprints. They were hard to see because most of the yard is grass, but in the dirt from my freshly dug fire pit, I saw two clear as day. They weren't mine. They were huge. My heart nearly came out of my chest. My mouth went dry and my brain felt fuzzy. Was there someone outside of my tent last night and I didn't know? Did I almost die because I was too afraid to check it out? I felt my legs start to wobble a bit and caught myself. I sprinted towards my back door, careful not to look behind me. I whipped open the door and was surprised to be greeted by the smell of bacon. My parents were already up and cooking breakfast. They turned to welcome me, but when they saw my chalk white face, they paused. "Are you okay, honey?" My mom asked. Yeah, I'm fine. You don't look fine," Dad added. "Rough night's sleep is all. I think the neighborhood dogs were excited about the moon or something." "Okay," Mom said, not believing a word that I was saying. "We made some breakfast to surprise you, but you came bursting in here.
Oh yeah, I have to go to the bathroom, I said and walked out of the room. I went into the bathroom and splashed water in my face and took several deep breaths. I was fine. Nothing happened. I needed to keep my cool, or my parents would never let me do anything like this again. I told myself I was being dumb and nothing happened. I almost believed it myself. When I sat down to eat my food, my dad looked over at me and smirked. What? You're a loud snorer, he chuckled. You heard me from out there? I shoveled eggs in my face. No, I came out last night to check on you. Dad, we wanted to make sure you were okay, my mom added. And it was. You'll understand when you have kids one day. And when did you come outside? Around 1-ish? And then the tumblers clicked. Wait, where did you stand to listen to me? In front of your tent. Why? I started laughing. It was my dad. Of course. I nearly shot eggs out of my nose. My parents looked at each other and then back at me. You know, I had a dream I saw you, I said, lying. It must have been you outside of my tent. Not as quiet as I thought, he said, taking a bite of toast. Yeah, I guess not, I said, catching my breath. Seriously though, I'm fine. Last night went off without a hitch. Tonight will be no different. They nodded in agreement. I felt fine again. I took a swig of OJ and I could feel my entire body relax. There wasn't anyone out there. Why would there be? We were in the middle of suburbia. As the night fell, I once again got a good fire going. I used the stick rubbing method, which took forever, but eventually I got it going. And yes, I'm aware of how that sounded out of context. I wanted to test myself to see if I can get something going for when I eventually did this off the grid. It took a minute, but the food I cooked over the flame that night tasted sweeter because of it. Last night was a new moon, and it was pitch black. The only light was my fire, which I kept burning bright, and my gas lantern. After I'd finished reading my book for the night and doused my fire, I decided to walk the backyard. Not totally sure why I wanted to do this, but I felt compelled. I started in the front right corner and worked my way around the fence counterclockwise. If my neighbors saw me, they'd assume I was up to no good, but thankfully, they were old and it was late. I didn't see anything along the fence, which was not surprising. I don't know what the hell I expected to find, but I kept going. When I got to the far right corner, I stopped and stared into the backyard of my neighbors directly behind us. I couldn't see much. They had a line of hedges that worked like a privacy fence. The people that lived there were new to the area, and my parents had met them, chatted between the fences. They seemed nice. Their backyard was spotless. As I moved along our cyclone fence, I noticed something clinging to the top railing. I swung my lamp around and saw a clump of dried mud that looked like it had been scraped off the metal. I walked over and touched it. It crumbled and fell to the ground. And that's when I saw footprints. The same ones I'd seen in the morning in front of my tent. Someone had been there, and it sure as hell wasn't my dad. I froze and I didn't know what to think. I suddenly became very aware that I was alone on the darkest night of the month. I decided not to check out the rest of the fence and slowly walked backwards towards my tent. I didn't know if anyone was watching, but I wanted to be ready to run just in case they were there. Then I heard the gate open in my backyard. In a flash, I quickly shut off my lantern. The darkness was sudden and terrifying. I wanted to run to my house, but whatever was back here now was closer to the back door than I was, and they would absolutely catch me. I was stuck. I ducked down and squatted down along the fence line. I held onto my lantern because if it came down to it, I was going to bash this into the face of whatever the hell came into our yard. I didn't realize it at first, but I had started to shiver from fear. Whoever walked into my backyard didn't close the gate behind them. My guess was that they wanted it for an easy escape route for when they finished. I didn't even want to think about what they wanted to finish. My eyes started to adjust to the darkness, but I could still barely make anything out. I saw my tent. The fabric wavered a bit in the breeze. And then I saw a figure walk near it. It was a man, and he was big. He moved slowly, methodically around the tent. He was like an animal stalking his prey. I had kept the windows and doors all zipped up, and if he was going to get in, he was going to have to risk unzipping the tent and waking me up. The man stopped and stared back at the house. And then he took something out of his waistband. It was a knife. He slowly moved away from the tent and made his way over to the back door. I knew it was unlocked because my parents wanted to wait for me to come in if I got too cold or scared, and he was heading inside and my parents were fast asleep. I needed to do something, but my mind was all over the place. I heard him walking up the deck stairs towards the back door, and I knew I was running out of time. I grabbed my lantern and tossed it as hard as I could to the opposite side of the yard. It landed with a smash on the ground. The man stopped and looked over in the direction of the noise. He turned away from the back door and ducked down. He waited a few seconds and then slowly started towards the noise. I looked over and saw the shovel that I had used to dig the fire pit. Thankfully, I was just irresponsible enough to have kept it out. I slowly started moving backwards towards the tent. At the same time, the man was walking towards the broken lantern. I knew I didn't have a lot of time, but I had to grab the shovel and hide before he realized it was just a lantern and not a person. Before he knew that he was being watched too. I was as quiet as I'd ever been, my eyes moving back from the shovel to the man. I took shallow breaths and kept moving. As soon as I grabbed the shovel, I ducked down and made my way to the back of the house. I hid along the wall, doing my best to blend along with the shadows. The man got to the fence line and picked up the broken lantern. He turned and headed back towards the tent. I was stunned at how fast he moved. In a few strides, he stood outside the back of my tent. I saw him raise the knife and then slice along the fabric. I could hear it tear from where I was sitting. And then, with violence that I've never witnessed, he stabbed down violently in my sleeping bag, again and again. He was focused on making whoever was in that tent pay. My legs felt like jello. My mouth was dry and I could barely catch my breath. But I knew I had to do something. My window for action was closing. If I didn't get him now, while he was distracted, I was never going to get him. As quickly and quietly as a deer, I ran towards him with a shovel above my head. As soon as I came within striking distance, I slammed the shovel down on his head. The man stumbled back and clutched his head. I raised it to strike again, but he scrambled out of reach. I yelled as loud as my voice could go. I kept yelling. Behind me, the lights in my parents' room snapped on. So did the neighbors. All of them, I think. The man got up, dropped his knife, and ran, hitting the gate and stumbling as he ran away. My parents came rushing out, and I dropped into their arms in tears. I've never hugged them tighter in my life. The police came and took a report, roped off the scene, and took evidence. I learned later a few people had been stabbed to death a few towns over, and this was probably the same person. It didn't make me feel any better. Nothing ever came from the police report. They never found the guy. My parents installed security cameras and our camping trips dropped down to 0. I've had a lot of counseling over the years, and I've even gone camping from time to time. Never managed to do any off-the-grid camping. I had a strange request from my parents. I wanted his knife. I knew it was evidence, and I might not ever get to see it, but I had to ask. The police say they needed to hold on to it. But about 5 years later, they closed the case and gave it to me. I have it still, a memento of the bravest thing I've ever done. I moved on from that town and tried to leave everything in the past, but every once in a while, I get a tickle down my spine like someone's watching me. It's barely PTSD, but sometimes I wonder. I always look for the footprints on the soil outside of my house. So far, I haven't seen any. But last night, when I let my dog out into the backyard, I swear I heard someone jump over the fence. Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so the gas didn't kill them, since it was toxic at high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they only had microphones and 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized windows into the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on but no bedding, running water and toilet, and enough dried food to last all 5 for over a month.
The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised falsely that they would be freed if they submitted to a test and didn't sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past, and the general tone of the conversations took on a darker aspect after the 4-day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led them to where they were. They started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternately whispering into the microphones and one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they seemed to think they could win the trust of their experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity, with them. At first, the researchers suspected this was all an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior is how the other captives reacted to it, or rather, didn't react to it. They continued whispering to the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. The 2 non-screaming captives took the books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering to the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure they were working, since they thought it was impossible that no sound could be coming with 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, researchers did something that they said they would not do to get a reaction from the captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives they were afraid were either dead or vegetables. They announced, "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom." To their surprise, they heard a single phrase in a calm voice respond, "We no longer want to be freed." Debate broke out among the researchers and military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed with stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately the voices from the microphone began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of loved ones to turn the gas back on. The chamber was opened and soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state that they were in life. The food rations past day 5 had not so much been touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subjects' thighs and chests stuffed into the drain at the center of the chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their body. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth, as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the positions and angles of the wounds indicated that most, if not all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the ribcage of all 4 test subjects had been removed, while the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place. The skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the ribcage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the test subject. The digestive tract of all 4 could be seen to be working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that they were digesting what was their own flesh they had ripped off and eaten over the course of days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still, many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left into the chamber, and
alternately begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. And to everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives, if you count the ones that committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured, and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of a morphine derivative, and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arm of one doctor. When heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he had bled out, to the point where there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach and just repeating the word "more" over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begging for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room in the facility. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back in his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative that they had to give him to prepare him for surgery. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought out to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist and even through the weight of a 200-pound soldier holding that wrist as well. It took only a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had tripled the normal level of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle not to be subdued. Most of them were from the force his own muscles had exerted on him. The second survivor had been the first of the group of 5 to start screaming. His vocal cords destroyed, he wasn't able to beg or object to surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when somebody suggested, reluctantly, they tried the surgery without anesthetic, and did not react to the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should be a medical impossibility for the patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so the patient could write his message. It was simple. Keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well, although they had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeon found it impossible to perform operations while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. The only response that was given was, "I must remain awake." All 3 subjects' restraints were reinforced, and they were placed back into the chamber, awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but they were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the test subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all 3 stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going back on the gas. It was obvious that at this point, all 3 were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might,
First left, then right, then left again for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for the EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves in surprise. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes they flatlined inexplicably. It looked as if he was repeatedly suffering brain death before returning to normal. Only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut at the same moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of a deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed the same flat lines as the one who had just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed, as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I won't be locked in here with these things. Not with you," he screamed as the man strapped to the table. "What are you?" he demanded. "I must know." The subject smiled.
"Have you forgotten so easily?"
the subject asked.
"We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread."
The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out.
"So nearly free."